probably need to be looked at or that are at least available for us to reduce them. So just a quick overview of what I'll cover. So I'll just do a quick recap on Lower Hutt's carbon footprint, and Dave outlined what some of those emission sources might be, but I'll do the align the microphone a bit better. Thank you. A brief recap on the climate action pathway that the city developed. Let's just do it this way. And then the key opportunities in each sector. So that's transport, stationary, and waste. And then we'll finish off with some final reflections. Okay. Now, this is what we're still trying to avoid. I'm not putting up the picture of the stuff that we're kind of locked into, but this is what we're trying to avoid, which is 2 meters of sea level rise, or in fact more. Now, that's not going to happen overnight, but it's certainly our children's children that will be subject to those sort of impacts that we're looking at. This is the Lower Hutt carbon footprint. So this is not the council, but the footprint of the city as a whole. So that's 110,000 people. 56% of that footprint is dominated by transport, the 30% energy, and then there is a few smaller sources. Now, it's very important to realize that this is a production footprint. Dave earlier talked about food, and that clearly has got a key impact as well. That's from a consumption perspective. So if you look at consumption, the picture changes a little bit. So like building and construction plays a key role, food consumption, obviously combustion of fuel as well. But this is looking at the production, so it's basically where the emissions are emitted. And you can see that there's a bit of a breakdown at the lower level here for some of those emission sources. This is actually a tool that's available on our website that we developed a few years ago. It's still quite different to the Future Fit calculator that Dave referred to, which we do have available in the Wellington region, and you can actually dive into that and look at it for a local version of what's available in Auckland. This footprint is about, this calculator is about options analysis. So it gives you the ability to look at a carbon footprint. This one is for Lower Hutt specifically, and then apply various scenarios to work out, well, what would that actually do? So I've plugged in a few scenarios in here, basically electrifying or largely electrifying the transport sector, and also electrifying the housing sector. And what that does is that, depending on the level of ambition, you can reduce your emissions now. But even with a reasonably ambitious scenario, or the parameters that are put in there, it does mean that it does actually show that there's a long way to go to get us to 2050 to actually reduce emissions down to zero, or net zero at least. For those that want to have a play around and have a bit of a feel for it, go to our website. It's available on here. And then the final piece of the recap is our climate action pathway, which we developed jointly or co-designed with the community back last year. It was launched in March 2022, and it does outline all the actions that we'll have to take, all the measures that are available and will need to be looked at least over the next few years. It doesn't have all the actions that are required to get us to net zero, but it certainly sets out the direction and the sort of things that we need. Okay, so let's look at the different sectors, and I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into transport, energy, and then finish off with waste. So these are the factors that basically facilitate emission reductions. They're really quite simple. It's about avoiding emissions where you can, so that's about housing and key services, being close to employment or near public transport, so you actually avoid the travel in the first place. It's shifting it, so connected networks, making it attractive for people to cycle and walk, so the Copenhagen example came up earlier. People-focused streets, making it easier for people to use PT, including the integrated ticketing system, which has been talked about for a long time, and it's only now being actually introduced in the Wellington region, which is good. and then improving it, which is electrifying the transport sector and making it more efficient. Now, I'm going to dive into the electrification of transport, not because I don't think that the other things don't have a role to play, far from it. But the electrification of transport is ultimately crucial, that even if you don't do anything else, even if you just convert a conventional vehicle into an electric vehicle, there's a massive amount of emissions to be reduced. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to do all these other things, or need to at least look at those. So they all have a role to play, but let's dive into electrification of transport as a key component for what's needed in Lower Hutt ultimately, given the scale of transport and the footprint. So here's a few things of what's already happening. So we've got the investments into walking and cycling links, and you'll be aware of those. We've got the additional charging infrastructure that we've just put in to facilitate EV uptake. A number of services now have new requirements, a number of procurement processes that we are running now have additional requirements around lowering the carbon footprint, decarbonisation, and there's also things like bus priority measures. But that's not just Hutt City Council. Clearly, it's a game of all players need to play their part. So other players have working on rail and bus improvements, so the integrated ticketing already mentioned, the bus fleet to be fully electric by 2030. So that's a key part of it. Electrification of the passenger ferries, which is underway. The Clean Car Discount Scheme that was referred to earlier. And the Low Emission Transport Fund, which helps fund and kick off some of the key projects to actually encourage that transition. And then things like rollout of EV charging stations by private providers. And not just for vehicles, but also for bikes and e-bikes. So a closer look at electrifying transport. Here's what's happening in New Zealand. So this is the EV market share. This is for light vehicles. And it's quite interesting what's happened over the last 18 to 24 months. There's been a noticeable uplift of the uptake of EVs in terms of new vehicle registrations, which is really positive. In a Wellington area and in urban areas, that tends to be higher than New Zealand-wide, which is not surprising given urban areas have a higher EV uptake. And you can see the conventional vehicle registration numbers declining. Now, some of this is being taken up by hybrids, but certainly the EV curve is worth having a look at. Now, this is Norway. And they've gone from 2011 with an EV market share of, in the new registrations, of probably roughly less than 5% to over 90%. I'm not saying that we are Norway or that this is because we don't have the same incentives, but it does show, what it does show is that the transition can be incredibly fast if you actually put your mind to it. The interesting thing is here, the interesting thing is that Hyundai just stopped selling ICE cars, conventional vehicles in Norway, because the sales have collapsed. There's actually no point in selling them anymore. VW is moving in the same direction, same as Volvo. So that's 90% of vehicles. So, and they have a national goal of having all vehicles electric coming in by 2025. So it does illustrate the transitional and the change and how quickly it can happen. Interestingly enough, New Zealand is probably about 7 years behind the curve right now. Here's another one. Some of you might have seen a slide before. I've stolen it from Tony Sieber, but it's always worth showing again. So for those that haven't seen it, this is New York 5th Avenue in 1900 versus 1913. Can anyone point out so on the left-hand side, you see a lot of horse carriages. Can anyone point out the vehicle, the motor vehicle? There's one. Oh, okay, I'll give it. There it is. It's a bit hard to see. 1913, that's only 13 years later. The same road corridor dominated by motor vehicles. Who can point out the single horse carriage? There it is. So again, disruption can really happen quickly. Not necessarily in this case it was convenience, economic reasons and other things, but it does show the scale of change and how quickly it can happen. Now, coming back to Lower Hutt, the earlier graph was about the new registration of vehicles coming in. This is the actual breakdown of vehicles in the fleet in Lower Hutt right now. So there is about 90,000 vehicles in Lower Hutt. That's for a population of 100,000 people. That's a lot of vehicles. And this is on top of this, so heavy vehicles would be on top of this. And the market share of EVs, which is that little green sliver at the top, is about 2% right now. Now, that means that in order for the whole fleet to change, it will take a number of years, and hence why it's so important that to lift up that new registration curve more quickly. So ultimately, increasing that actual market share in the city for EVs will help us lower the emissions across the city. You hold it. And if you can just hold the question, if that's okay. Okay, so what may be needed? This is what the Climate Change Commission advice has just released in its draft advice that was released last week, I think. And it's very similar to what they've previously said, but I've just pulled out a few of the things that line up with the other things that we've talked about before, which is support for improved urban form, simplified planning and increased funding of integrated transport networks, more support for car sharing and e-bikes, sustained support for EVs. Some people say, we've done the clean car discount for a couple of years, but let's move on. This is not sustainable yet. We haven't really improved. The overall share of EVs in the fleet is still very, very small. They're also arguing for a phase-out date for ICE vehicles. Some European countries have done that already. Investment and removal of barriers regarding charging infrastructure, and then support and incentives to decarbonise freight. And commercial vehicles obviously play a big part in terms of the transport carbon footprint. And in order to affect emissions in Lower Hutt, so that's coming back to our carbon footprint for the city, the things that would make a difference are things like urban renewal, network improvements, so that's cycleway connectivity to get that mode shift. Going faster and further on, encouraging the electrification of vehicles used in our own Hutt City Council contracts, because a lot of the contractors that we use, they operate in the valley and they use vehicles that are part of that picture that I showed earlier. So encouraging them to electrify their services will help the city as a whole, not just our footprint. The Low Carbon Acceleration Fund can play a role in kickstarting initiatives and getting people onto that different journey. EV car sharing, there's been a lot of work in that place over the last 3 years. We haven't quite nailed it yet. We're still not there, but we are talking to a provider to come here. More hypercharging stations. So those are not the ones that we've just rolled out, but they're the ones that like a petrol station where you pull in, you charge for 15 minutes and you leave with a full tank of power. We don't have any of those yet in Lower Hutt, but there's some work underway to get that going as well. And roaming for EV charging. So this is a frustrating topic. Looking at some European countries, we're sort of heading down the same path where every charging station operator's got their own app, their own account. So you need 15 accounts to use any device, any charging station. So like an FPOS model where you can just plug and play without really having to think about who takes the money and passes it on to the right party. Now, stationary energy. That's the second sector in our city, 30%. Here are some of the factors to facilitate emission reductions. So density of urban form. A denser urban form is more efficient. Improving energy efficiency of houses and transitioning out of fossil fuels, including fossil gas for heating. And more renewable and low carbon energy generation. So that's improving the renewability share of electricity generation. Now, what's already happening at council, we've got investment in placemaking, so that's parts of Riverlink, for example, and increased urban density. I know there's some challenges around it, but ultimately things like shifting the railway station and making it more convenient in relation to the CBD, that's all things to encourage a different way of travel. Free home energy efficiency advice for residents. The new Nainai pool, really great to see that we're still working towards that Green Star rating. And my understanding is we're well on track with that, and no fossil gas for heating in that pool. Compared to the old pool, that will massively improve the carbon footprint and the efficiency. All council facilities phasing out fossil gas. Eastbourne we've already done, at least for the main pool, and the Douse and the Mackenzie are currently in the pipeline. And Urban Plus, since 2019, hasn't been able to put any fossil gas heating into, or cooking, heating, space heating into any of their new developments. So we can sort of demonstrate that actually some of this is working. And then what others are doing, there's Warmer Kiwi Homes grant funding available to go to heat pumps out of gas, for example. We've got support for decarbonisation of process heat. So we've got a lot of businesses in Lower Hutt that use, say, gas boilers and other things. So there's support for that. Minimum energy efficiency performance standards, and quite interestingly here, Kaingaora has already committed as part of their housing specs that they're not putting any new fossil gas into any of their new developments. So that's really good to see as well. So looking at a closer look at electrifying homes. Now here's the types of heating used in Lower Hutt. This is based on the last census. The latest data is not available yet. I don't think it's massively changed though, so it's still a good indicator of what's in the city currently. You will see gas makes up, so these numbers don't add up to 100% because a lot of homes have 2 types of heatings or 3 types of heatings, but around about 30% of households, between a quarter and a third of households still use some sort of fossil gas for heating purposes. And we also have a bit of coal in the mix, which is really interesting. I find it quite amazing how in this day and age, we are actually still able, you can go down to a local Bunnings or a Mitre 10 and you can pick up a coal bag when heat pumps and alternative technologies are actually far more efficient. If you work out the dollar cost per kilowatt hour, coal is incredibly expensive. This is the fossil gas footprint in comparison to when you heat with electricity. So this is the difference. And that difference will only improve the further the renewable, the further improvement we'll see in terms of energy generation in New Zealand. So if you go from 85 to 90% and to 100% potentially, then that will drop further. Now, this is an interesting graph. This is the additional emissions that we've modeled based on new developments, and a share of these will have gas built into them. So this is the additional emissions over the next 30 years. Potentially, the midpoint is around 8,000 tonnes of CO2 will be in relation to gas being put into a new development being built today or in the next few years. As soon as you've got that built in, people will start using that, obviously, and that will then contribute to an increased carbon footprint. So the whole time we're talking about reducing emissions, what I'm saying is increased use of fossil gas will actually increase the emissions across the city. So that will definitely work against what we're actually trying to do in terms of the climate action pathway. Looking at the alternatives though, there's plenty of good news there. When you look at this is Consumer New Zealand data, looking at the cost comparison of various heating technologies, and heat pumps are usually by far the most efficient option. Now, why not hydrogen? Looking at heating, the gas network. It's already there. Why don't we just put hydrogen in there? And that's one topic that is currently widely discussed. True, hydrogen does only emit water when it's burnt, but the issue here is that looking at our target in the climate action pathway of halving emissions by 2030, the first issue is that there is no hydrogen available right now. And it's very unlikely to be a significant player even in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's got no role to play in halving emissions across our city. There are significant challenges and costs to actually feed it into the gas network. So it can be blended with fossil gas, but if you have a blend of 20% or more, you actually need to replace all the appliances anyway. So if that's the case, why don't you just buy a heat pump and use electricity? Everyone's got an electricity connection. So electrifying here makes absolute sense. Apart from, the cost implications of actually replacing the infrastructure and amending it or upgrading it so it can actually handle this. The other interesting thing, and Dave will be an expert on this more than me, but you can put it into your gas networks, but hydrogen is also subject to leakage, more so than methane, and it's also got implications in terms of other greenhouse gas emissions. It's very energy intensive to produce, so you need about 2 to 3 times the amount of electricity to make the hydrogen to then use it for heating compared to just putting it into a heat pump and using that. So I find it really difficult to understand why we're even talking about hydrogen for things like local heating of homes and businesses. There is a role for hydrogen, but it's actually in the hard to electrify applications. So like steel, urea making, all the possibly air travel, things like that, rather than there is a solution available. It's heat pumps, it's electrifying your homes as it is with transport. Why are we looking at another solution to go beyond that? So I'm just putting that slide up there because I know it's being discussed frequently. So what may be needed in the Lower Hutt context? So the Climate Change Commission has been talking about more renewable energy generation, support for energy efficiency, improved demand-side management. So that's also things like making sure that we don't all charge our EVs at 1 minute past 9, because that creates a super peak. And there is a lot of work underway with the lines companies that I'm aware of that is actually looking at remotely controlling some of these so that actually they're not all kicking in at the same time, that it's managed based on where the load is. Targeted support for replacing fossil gas for some households and businesses. And they also, again, emphasize the need to prohibit new gas connections, because they recognize, as I've just talked about, that you keep allowing those, you will just add to the carbon footprint rather than reducing emissions. And then in terms of to affect emissions in Lower Hutt, so coming back to the carbon footprint, that 30%, in order for the city overall to reduce its emissions, here's the sort of things that should be considered in order to do that. So the Low Carbon Acceleration Fund can play a role. It won't necessarily do that at the large scale, but it can impact change by giving people or reducing the risk of decarbonizing, at least for some businesses and organizations, and they will then encourage others to follow through. It's encouraging alternative low carbon heating technologies. Now, some of this might well be central government funded, so this is not necessarily a list of this is something that Hutt City Council must do, but it's the sort of things that we would need to have happen in order for Lower Hutt to reduce its footprint. No fossil gas connections, at least no new ones. Phasing out the use of coal for residential heating. Solar PV on council facilities, and there may well need to be more incentives, or and some of it is already economically very viable, more solar PV on residential properties and for businesses. And finally, the waste sector, before I finish off. This is what the Climate Change Commission said. So transition to a more circular economy. Again, it's about avoiding waste, just like avoiding energy. Better resource recovery and infrastructure for organic waste and construction and demolition waste. Best practice waste treatment. Incentivizing greater landfill gas capture performance, and we've already done a lot of this at Silverstream. And clear long-term pricing signals regarding future waste levy increases. So there is certainty in the system about what's coming, so that there is certainty for investment into alternatives. And then what's already happening, we talked about the gas system at Silverstream. So councillors will recall we installed a flare, and that's made a massive difference over the last couple of years. We've got a performance contract with LMS to incentivise methane destruction. So it's not just get us to the minimum, but how do you get beyond that? So destroy more than you have to. The new curbside service, the optional green waste collection, the number of subscribers continues to grow. The food waste business case, that work is currently underway. And we've got a new manager waste minimisation to help drive this. The interim upgrades to the Silverstream transfer station, diversion of green waste. Councillors will recall we moved from using green waste for landfill cover to actually composting it a couple of years ago. And then the new waste management and minimisation plan that we're currently developing. And then others have a role to play. There's obviously the waste levy increases. There is waste management. Currently has got a resource consent application in for that new resource recovery park in Manor Park. And also Wellington Water working on options around managing biosolids and sludge, because that is also a big contributor to the footprint at the landfill. So those are the things that ultimately can assist in getting the footprint down, but it's obviously not just something that Hutt City Council can do itself. It's a whole of community approach that's needed here. Now, final reflections. We're still only at the beginning of our carbon reduction journey. So, yeah, we're just at the beginning. We've only just starting to shift the curve. The delay will only make it harder. So if you look at the graph here, if there had been more concise action, decisive action taken in the 2000s or the 1990s, the journey would have been a lot less rocky and smoother. The further we wait, the more delay there is to make uncomfortable decisions, the harder it will get to actually halve emissions. And every tonne emitted now stays in the atmosphere for a long time, so it contributes to the warming. But equally, I want to finish on a positive note, just like Dave. Change can happen really quickly. If you look at the Norway example, if you look at the New York Fifth Avenue, so some of that change can happen really quickly. It's just a matter of how, are we putting our minds to this? So I wanted to leave that with council, and it's a useful stopping point from, we did the climate action pathway last year. It's been just about over a year. So this was like that was a good point to say, okay, this is kind of where we're at right now. And it's a useful segue into the next long-term plan discussion, which is coming up, and some of the other workshops that are coming up, including the food waste on organics and green organics, coming up on the 14th of June. So they will basically then dive a little bit more into the deeper end of some of those measures that we're actually working on, at least at the Hutt City Council. I'll leave you with that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian, for the presentation, and to you and the team for the work sitting behind it. First